The question of if liberals can be leftists is making its rounds again on TikTok.
I'm a leftist and I'm a Democrat, and that's not a contradiction.
They never call me a leftist.
My name's Ome. I'm a political science and sociology double major. I attend one of the top 10 universities in the world. And this question falls almost too neatly within both of the fields that I am studying in. First, I'm going to talk about capitalism and how it's related to this. Then I'm going to talk about liberalism versus conservatism. And finally, I'm going to talk about the Overton window and what leftist infighting is. Before we can talk about if liberals can be leftists, we first have to establish what capitalism is. According to Oxford Dictionary, capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. And according to sociology, all economic structures also double as social structures and impact society bigger than any other social structure. The key elements here are the for-profit ownership of the means of production. What this means is that the owner of a business controls the profit outcomes for all of the workers inside of a company. For example, if you are a barista at a coffee shop, even if you do 70% of the labor, you do not get 70% of the profit share from a cup of coffee. You probably see 1 to maybe 5 to maybe 10% if you're at a really, really good job. The majority of the profit is controlled by the owner. That means that the owner makes the majority of the profit off of that cup of coffee. Capitalism itself has a natural opposition, and that is communism. Communism, by every recognized institution, is on the political left. It is considered the furthest leftmost point in all of politics. Now I'm going to define liberalism and conservatism, which are respectively the Democratic and Republican parties' political ideologies. Oxford Dictionary defines liberal as relating to or denoting a political and social philosophy that promotes individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. The key aspect of this definition is free enterprise. Enterprise is a synonym for company or business, or commercial undertaking, aka a free market. A conservative, on the other hand, favors free enterprise, private ownership, and socially traditional ideas. Hopefully, by this point, you've been able to put 2 and 2 together and recognize that liberalism and conservatives are both working to reform capitalism. Liberalism is the left wing of American politics, but it is not leftism. And I put together a handy-dandy chart. As you can see here, the American Overton window rests squarely ending at liberalism on the furthest leftmost point. And the furthest rightmost point is fascism. This is because capitalism actually naturally deteriorates into fascism. Free market trade is predicated on the constant consumption of products. These products, of course, are naturally produced by exploitation. Going back to the barista metaphor, why does the owner, who does no more work, inherently get more money for doing less? American capitalism argues that the owner did something by simply owning things. This is the same thing that happens when a landlord owns a home and doesn't do anything to that home, doesn't even work in that home. All they do is own things. And the myth to say that they're doing some kind of work, but in reality, all they do is own the property that you rent. This is an inherently exploitative process. It applies to the global south as well, and countries that are more marginalized than the United States. And this is exactly what leads to things like the genocide in Congo and the very oppressive and exploitative contract in between the United States and Mexico for water. This is because free enterprise is inherently coercive. It requires the global south to give up its wealth and resources to countries that have better military power. And ultimately, capitalists will use windows of opportunity to exploit the global south. This is why the global south considers liberalism the furthest rightmost point. And for the global south, leftism actually begins at reluctant Democrat, people who do not believe in the reform of capitalism. Leftism begins at the abolition of the current social and economic system, aka a revolution. That's what a revolution means by definition. It means a transition from one social and economic structure into another. It doesn't mean inherently any kind of violence. It doesn't mean war. It doesn't mean revolt. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means a transition into one social and economic structure into another. And leftists have a pluralism, meaning a variety of different ideas about what the leftist ideology should be and how to completely abolish capitalism. And that in between point is called socialism. It's the advancement towards a more left solution. Some people believe in communism. Some people believe in another iteration of communism, such as primitive communism, which is an indigenous forward style of communism. And I don't know where the definition of a classless, moneyless, and stateless society came from, but that is an inaccurate definition. It's actually just a pop culture reference, but it's not real. In fact, there have been multiple societies that are not capitalist and that are arguably communist that have had money in them, so money has very little to do with anything. Saying that communism is a classless society is kind of like saying communism is communist. It's not really very helpful. And statelessness is a whole other political issue all on its own, so that's just not related to communism. I wrote my own definition. I've read all of Marx's works, and I've read them multiple times in academic settings because I think it's more handy that you hear it from more than one person. And I wrote a social and economic structure driven by the will of the working class and the elimination of poverty and exploitation. Going back to that coffee shop metaphor, ownership of a business wouldn't exist. It would be a cooperative ownership situation, a flattening of a hierarchy, and everybody would have to work the same amount and everybody would profit share the same amount. For most ethical individuals, this is the Overton window. This is where leftism is. And now I'm going to tell you about what leftists actually fight about. And I can tell you that it's not electoral politics. As we've discussed, leftists start at the rejection of capitalism, therefore the abolition of the current and economic system. But going back to what I mentioned previously, one of the key aspects of infighting is statelessness, and not whether or not statelessness should happen, rather when it should happen and in what context. Another political philosophy that leftists sometimes fight about is Maoism, which is essentially the concept of legitimate violence and how to use it in the context of a revolution and what is ethical. Another aspect, which is probably the most popular amongst leftists, is Leninism, which is the authority of the poor or the working class. This is also known as a dictatorship of the working class, aka the proletariat. And generally, the majority of leftist infighting is how to achieve a more socialist society. It has very little, if not completely not any relationship to electoral politics altogether, because the bipartisan monopoly inside of politics in the United States are reformists. They seek to reform the political system, the social and economic system of capitalism. And leftists reject capitalism. Sorry, this was a long one, I know, but it's kind of an important thing to realize, and I really wanted to settle this from an academic point of view. So no, you can't be a liberal and a leftist because liberalism operates to advance capitalism, and leftism works to advance leftism.